I'm going to call on Professor Jo Littler, and Jo is from Goldsmiths. She's a professor of cultural, media and social analysis and works on cultures of inequality. Jo's books include Left Feminisms with Care Collective, The Care Manifesto, one I'm well familiar with, Against Meritocracy from 2018, Radical Consumption, and with Roshi Naidu, The Politics of Heritage, The Politics of Race. She co-edits the European Journal of Cultural Studies and is part of the editorial collecting of Soundings, a journal of politics and culture, and is the judge of 2025 Stuart Hall Foundation Essay Prize. But above all else, Jo is our keynote today and is going to nudge and inform us a little bit more on classism. So over to you, Jo. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you for that really generous introduction, Barbara, and it's great to hear more about UCD. It's wonderful to be here at an event which is framed around the issue of class and classism, and to be here at a university which is obviously taking the issue of class, of discrimination against people because of their class background, seriously. And to be at one which has developed such a trailblazing programme to actually deal with these issues on the ground. It's really, really inspiring, and it's just been wonderful just to walk around the campus and see all your signs as well, and the kind of inclusion you have at all different levels. So thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to listening to what everyone has to say today. So I'm a social and cultural theorist, and I'm going to explore some of the different dimensions of class and classism. And so this will include some of the broader or macro issues, as well as questions of representation and a few personal anecdotes in order to help try and open up the conversation about the range and complexities of the issue. Because class, as I'm sure you know, is complex. It is also simple, it is structural, and it is personal. Everyone has their own particular stories, whether these are painful, moving, hilarious, or horrifying, or all of them at the same time. So let's begin with this word classism, and to break it down to class. What's in a word to begin with? So the Welsh cultural theorist Raymond Williams pointed out in his book from 1983, Keywords, which traces the historical and cultural meaning of words which are particularly used and particularly freighted. He pointed out that class is a particularly complicated and difficult word. And in fact, when it was first used in English, it had a special connection to education. And this meaning is still there. So you might think about how we talk about classes in schools, and we talk about degree classes to indicate different rankings of educational groups and what people achieve in university. And the contemporary meaning of class in terms of social division in relation to occupation and wealth only really solidified with the Industrial Revolution and the formation of factory work in the 19th century in the UK. So class has been theorised in many different ways. In the 20th century, it notoriously became linked to these ABCDE categories of occupation developed by the National Readership Survey, which was actually a market research mechanism designed to help sell goods. But it was widely used. It kind of caught the imagination of a lot of different sociologists and journalists, for instance. And then in the early 2000s, such typologies were updated by Mike Savage's team at the LSE in conjunction with a BBC survey. And what they tried to do was to develop new categories to represent the changing world of work, to include, for example, new technologies and new forms of precarity. But the issue of inherited wealth is one which can sometimes disappear from view in these categories. And it's one which has also become increasingly important again over the past few decades. So we increasingly live in an asset economy, as the academics Lisa Adkins and co put it, or an inheritocracy, as the mass market book by Eliza Philby coins the same concept. So if parents can, for example, afford to help their children with, say, a deposit for a mortgage for a house or a flat, or if someone inherits significant sums of money, this can potentially be more significant for your class location than your job. So today, any good sociological categorization of class will include assets and not just income. Now, as a lot of you will know, class has many different dimensions, some of which were pinpointed by the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. He theorized different modes of capital beyond that of the economic. So he talked about cultural capital, the kind of knowledge or leisure pursuits which indicate class identity. So, for example, being able to drop in that you like to go skiing. Or social capital, who you know, kind of social networks you're part of, the social networks you can tap into, maybe for jobs. And the symbolic capital that accrues to you through what you do, through your reputation, whether it's something which is fated or something which is stigmatized. So all of these kind of obviously have very direct implications for working class students at university, who, for instance, has the social capital to get a good internship, to be able to afford to do it after university, or who has enough cultural capital to be able to answer very loaded interview questions. So, for example, at age 17, I went to an interview at an elite university where I was asked to read some deeply alien 15th century poetry out loud, and I was asked about my experience of overseas travel, both of which felt extremely alienating and shaming and did not put me at ease or enable me to show what I could do. It was excruciating. So I know this is an area which in education studies a lot of work has been done on, as well as on the ground. So there was some really interesting work, for example, by the American legal scholar Lani Gounier, who looked at how Harvard's admission policies had changed according to race and class over time, and by, say, Nicola Ingram, who's looked at working class boys in the UK and Ireland and how they relate to admissions processes. Okay, so this brings us to the question of classism. What is it? Well, let's take one widely used dictionary definition that's in circulation. Classism is a belief that a person's social or economic station in society determines their value. It's behaviour that reflects this belief, so prejudice or discrimination based on class. And it's also the systematic oppression of the lower class and middle class, even to the advantage of the upper class. Now, this word classism doesn't really have the same cultural currency, does it, of a word like sexism or racism. It doesn't trip off the tongue in the same way. It's not been so extensively used or widely disseminated. And I think it hasn't been so popularised in the same way, primarily because class itself has only recently become a more acceptable subject of academic and public discussion again. And it's been talked about more widely, I think, now, partly because of expanding levels of literacy on what class means and what privilege means, and also because this is a time when we have very visible and expanding levels of inequality and injustice around us. And therefore, class is becoming more conspicuous and more impossible for people to ignore. Now, there are no end of graphs and statistics on this topic, but let's take just a few. So firstly, the new Oxfam report, Takers and Makers, shows, for instance, how billionaire wealth grew 3 times faster last year than the year before. It's surging. This kind of global inequality is surging, and largely through inheritance. So whereas the position of the poor globally has flatlined, and in many cases become poorer, billionaire and on the horizon trillionaire wealth is surging. Secondly, this graph from Thomas Piketty's blockbusting economic bestseller Capital from a decade ago showed how Anglo-European countries were moving away from the mid-20th century trend of social democracy, which had more social safety nets, obviously was not perfect by a long stretch, but much more forms of public welfare provision, and moving into a more savagely unequal state of affairs which hadn't been seen since the early 20th century. Now, I know Ireland is not as economically unequal as a lot of countries on that score, on that graph, but as data from UCD's own Professor Brian Nolan has shown, it's still been following this overarching pattern. In the UK, for example, we have this probably more extreme in some ways because of austerity policies, for instance. We have a very sharp increase in poverty. 1 million kids live in poverty now. So in combined sense, all these trends mean that the issue of increasing poverty and class position, class privilege and class inequality is thrown into relief. It's much harder for people to sweep under the carpet. Now, I went to university in the north of England in the early 1990s, at a time when class was positioned as something that had largely been solved, as not really deemed necessary to discuss. On the degree course that I took, it was positioned as a subject which was a little bit outmoded, a little bit embarrassing. There was a suspicion that if you were interested in it, it would mean you probably had reductive, questionable, or old-fashioned politics. And it's been noted by a fair number of academics that it was very difficult to talk or publish on the topic of class at this time in the 90s. So Anita Baresi and Heather Nunn, for instance, write in the preface to their book Class and Contemporary Culture, Contemporary British Culture, about how it took them 10 years to secure a publisher because so many of them thought the subject itself was passé. And similarly, in the different prefaces to the sociological classic, Class and Stratification, Rosemary Crompton charts the waning interest in the topic. I think you can tell so much from looking at the prefaces of books. It's one of my favourite parts of books. It's kind of where all the secrets get let out in the text. So the 1990s was a kind of moment of the zenith of postmodernism. It was a time when Francis Fukuyama told us that Western liberal democracies had triumphed worldwide. All major social issues had pretty much been solved and dealt with. We were, as he put it, at the end of history. There wasn't going to be any more after this, which, now looks like a joke, but still. It was a time of third-way politics when neoliberal culture told us that we'd largely solved inequalities of class, race and gender, and that if you worked hard, as the singer Yaz put it in her top 10 hits, the only way is up. So the overwhelming message in the wider culture was that we were now post-class. Anyone could make it to the top of that social pile, no matter what your background, if only you put in the graft. It was just a matter of talent combined with effort. So this message was later, I think, very widely disseminated by endless competitive reality TV competitions, which told us, gave us the message that we live in a meritocratic society. It's up to you to make it. Just put your shoulder to the wheel. Now, as a young adult, I had quite conflicted feelings about these messages. I was both very taken with them, the idea that anyone could make it and its potential, coming from, as I did, from a background where no one in my family had been to university, and I was at the lower end of those classifications on the graphs that we saw. But I was also very frustrated by this narrative of meritocracy, because whilst I made it, in conventional terms, through to university education, and eventually to middle class, respectable employment, it was also only too clear to me that this was just not true for a lot of my peers or for a lot of members of my extended family. In other words, the playing field was definitely not level, even though it was being painted that way. It was spectacularly uneven, and I could see that it was becoming more so. The social ladder was lengthening. So I was the last generation to go to university in the UK before the introduction of fees, and if they'd been as high as they are now in the UK, I probably wouldn't have gone. So eventually I wrote a book published, as Barbara said, in 2018, excavating this idea of meritocracy and tracing how it had mutated in political discourse, and looking how over the past 50 to 60 years, the word had been twisted against the grain of its original use. So there's been a complete U-turn in its meaning. It started out as pretty much a swear word, as a negative description of how to organise society. So why, Alan Fox said in the first recorded use of the term in 1956, would you give extra economic prizes to those who are already gifted and blessed? And then in the late 1950s, the philosopher Hannah Arendt said, meritocracy contradicts the principle of equality, of an egalitarian democracy, no more than any other oligarchy. But then by the late 1970s, the term began to be used in a different way by people like Daniel Bell, who thought that it might be a term that they could use to stoke the knowledge economy. They thought they could use it to indicate opportunity for all. So the term is rehabilitated, and then by the late 1980s, it's being used quite blatantly to argue for increased marketisation, as in this policy briefing here, Meritocracy in the Classless Society, which argues for the privatisation of comprehensive schooling in the UK. So meritocracy became mobilised widely as a trope to encourage hyper-individualised selection and competition. And I argued that this narrative acted to spotlight those who had made it between classes to produce parables of progress, or what Barbara called in her chapter in the book on education that I was just reading, the one that's most recently come out, Equality for All and University Design, zeros to heroes. So these stories, these narratives, were used to justify the privatisation of social welfare systems and the lengthening of the social ladder. And I termed this formation neoliberal meritocracy. And we might summarise what's problematic with it, what's wrong with it, as follows. So firstly, it can become used as a myth to obscure inequality. We don't have a level playing field. And for some people, that makes meritocracy the wrong idea to promote. For others, like Lani Gounier, we need something different. We need to promote democratic merit. And for both of those groups, we have to tackle the question of economic inequality. Second, it tends to promote a very individualised version of social worth, as kind of symbolised by this image of the ladder. So as Raymond Williams once put it, the ladder is a device that can only be used individually. You go up the ladder, the social ladder, alone. He said that meritocracy is a trope which sweetens the poison of hierarchy. So meritocracy today often usually promises opportunity whilst offering and fostering social division. So I argued that in the contemporary era, its promises have become louder and louder, and competitive forms of participation have become presented as kind of moral obligation for people, whilst at the same time that social ladder has become longer. Because for most working class and lower middle class people in the US and Europe, that potential for social mobility has in fact declined. There's less room at the top as middle class jobs and the public sector has contracted. Then third, meritocracy often assumes that talent or intelligence is something which is always inborn primarily. It's essentialised, it's either given the chance to succeed or not. And whilst there's something to that, really merit and talent are quite, they're much more complex. They're part of much more complex ecologies. So you might have a talent for playing clarinet, but you never know that unless you have an access to the instrument and you have time and you have encouragement and you can follow that through at different levels and you can afford to play it. So whilst talent and merit, what they mean has been profoundly problematic. They've been gendered and racialised in very particular ways. Certain people having less merit, for example, was an argument used in apartheid and against the suffragettes. Then fourth, there's a bit of a problem in the hierarchical ranking of status that it endorses. So why, for example, certain professions are put at the top and whether they should be there is a question that we often don't ask. It's less discussed. So why is it that being a singer or an entrepreneur have become much more feted and popularised in the media, become roles to aspire to and that can be so economically rewarded above those of, say, a doctor or a teacher or a vet? In other words, it helps extend a very narrow status system in which some roles are rendered successful and others, particularly traditional working class roles, are rendered abject. So I think we kind of need to really revalue, think about what is at stake in that status system. So often, for example, when we talk about narratives of social mobility and escape, it's the upper and middle class lifestyles that are being positioned as something to aspire to. But you might think, for example, of how a housing council estate has a lot more sociability than, say, a gated community. What is actually being valued? Do we need to pick that apart? Yes, we do. So this is all why Michael Sandel, in his later book on meritocracy, argues that contemporary meritocracy works by flattering those who rise through the social pile. It convinces them a little bit too much that they were worth it, that they earned it. They have what he calls meritocratic hubris, in which the winners inhale too deeply of their success. Whilst at the same time, more working class and lower middle class people who don't go to university are stigmatised as losers, which fuels, as he puts it, a rise in right-wing populism. So narratives of meritocracy and social mobility, in other words, can work to shame and stigmatise working classes as laughable, as not respectable, or as underclasses. And this kind of stigmatisation, these forms of belittling, has a very long history, of course. But from the 2000s in the UK, there was a very noticeable upswing in the castigation of the working classes. This is something that the academic Imogen Tyler pointed out in her book on stigma and resistance to it, revolting subjects, and something the journalist Owen Jones captured well and argued in his book Chavs. It was a time when increasing scorn was being poured on the working class. And this actually fits with the kind of neoliberal trope of meritocracy and social mobility, as we were being told that class wasn't important, whilst also being told it was a race to the top, and implicitly that we should become more middle class, more upper class. There are plenty of examples of such belittlement that circulated in media culture. So in programmes like What Not to Wear, for instance, two extremely posh aristocratic women tried to teach working class women to look respectable. And the wealthy white actors Matt Lucas and David Walliams developed the working class character Vicky Pollard and her 18 kids in the comedy series Little Britain. You know, it's kind of widely publicised form of shaming through humour. As Beverly Skeggs put it in her classic 1997 work of cultural sociology, Formations of Class and Gender, representation matters. And for class, it can be a key site of symbolic violence and the production of shame. So Bev and I are currently writing an article together about how there's been a cultural backlash against this moment, against the disparagement of the working classes. So it's no longer considered so passé, so outrageous to mention or to write about class. There's much more publicity about the lack of working class involvement in cultural production, for instance. As you can see, you know, people like Julie Walters speaking out on the subject, as well as the emergence of groups which are often quite grassroots in origin, designed to mentor people from working class backgrounds. So Arts Emergency, for instance, works to promote working class representation in British arts. And the 93% Club encourages people from state schools, which constitute 93% of the population in the UK, to thrive at university, where we only have, in Britain, 49% state-educated students. I know it's a lot better here. You know, you have, well, into the 70s, don't you, of state-educated students here. Well done. And they also offer kind of mentoring schemes to try and help each other crack into elite careers like law, where working-class students are excluded. And then, also as part of a wider project run by Sam Friedman, Mike Savage and Carlos Sporhauser, we also became interested in this genre of what's called Autosociobiography, which is a real mouthful. But these are kind of forms of memoir which position people's life narratives in wider social context and which work to locate class subjectivities in history. It's often this book, Returning to Reims by the academic Didier Eribon, which gets cited as a classic of the genre. He writes of how, after he became a respectable academic, it wasn't being gay so much as being working class that he found hard to come to terms with and deal with. So this book, which is a bestseller, is about him reconciling himself with that context and figuring it out. But the term autosociobiography was used by a woman, Annie Ernaux, in her book The Years, which has also become a play, in which she mixes her own story about coming from a working class background, going to university, becoming a writer, with kind of major political events and forms of social and cultural change that are happening in France at the time. So the kind of popularity of these forms of autoethnography, about upward social mobility, about moving into a different cultural realm, have been theorised recently as being transclass, working across classes, by Chantal Jacquet, another French theorist. So often the tones and the themes that emerges from these memoirs, she says, are very bittersweet. They involve alienation from the place where you grew up, what Sam Friedman's called the price of the ticket. They involve the idea of being caught between two worlds, but also this kind of cross-class, trans-class perspective being a perspective of immense learning, being able to see really broader and wider social contexts and social fabrics. So we got interested in this in genre, and how often it was the men in particular which seemed to be getting a lot of the attention, when it was women that had been doing it for years and had even coined the term. And you can in fact look back and think about lots of other key early work which has been very influential, like Carolyn Steedman's book Landscape for a Good Woman, where she points out that she'd have these encounters with people that she'd meet at a party, and she'd be very conscious of class background in a way that she knew they weren't. And the kind of necessity to create new genres and new forms of writing and representation to show these positions which weren't occupied in the culture. So today, and I know we're going to hear from Marlene soon, I'm really looking forward to that as part of this genre. So what struck Bev and I is how there are, in fact, today a lot of semi-autobiographical popular texts and TV series around by female working class writers, and how a lot of them have this different tone about them from the ones in the past. Often they are, very energetically rejecting the types of stigma and the types of labelling that have been given to them, as in this memoir by Cash Carraway, which also became the basis for the TV series Rain Dogs. They are taking all the scorn and the stigma poured onto working class women and throwing it back. And this is also spectacularly the case with Michaela Cole's comedy series Chewing Gum, about growing up on a London estate, and Alma's Not Normal, which is about Sophie Williams' life growing up in Bolton, in and out of care. She says, this is, I was a bit like the baby from Trainspotting if it had lived. So these are works which have a very distinct tone. They offer a frank and funny rejection of stereotypes, and they also kick back at injustice, inequality, and the exploitations that they are forced to deal with. So Alma's Not Normal, for instance, will involve lots of asides about the context of austerity and how it sent her mum kind of spiralling into mental health crises. So she kind of lays that social and political side by side with her experience. And a similar set of motifs, I think, are also presented in the Channel 4 series Big Boys. Don't know if any of you have seen that, which is based on Jack Rook's 3 years as a student at the University of Westminster, which becomes fictionalised as the University of Brent. And it's really good, I think, at showing some of the different support systems people have or don't have at university, depending on their class background. So, for instance, it shows how not everyone has a home to go to in the holidays. Not everyone has support over the summer. Not everyone has that protection in place for when they leave. And it raises these issues and it talks around them, and it talks about how it intersects, and particularly with men's experience and issues around masculinity and not being able to discuss it, and male mental health. So that's also worth checking out if you haven't seen it. So this in turn, I think, highlights the importance and this necessity really of thinking about class intersectionally. So what formation is class taking? How, for instance, some of the kind of contexts that we have around us are affecting certain intersections of class really directly. So the growth in poverty amongst the disabled because of welfare cuts, for instance, in the UK. So there's a long history as well to thinking about how class has been racialised. There's lots and lots of work on this. And one thing which I've enjoyed a lot recently is Ash Sarkar's book, Minority Rule, which discusses how there's been a new emphasis on a very racialised strand of class, the white working class, by the far right, by figures like Nigel Farage and Tommy Robinson in the UK. So she describes how the right has moved, in effect, from total scorn of the working classes in the 2000s, that moment when Owen Jones was writing that book, Chavs, and Imogen Tyler was writing Revolting Subjects, to the very selective, racialised, racist rehabilitation of a fraction of the working class today in a very instrumental way for their own multi-millionaire ends. So class, in other words, is complex and simple, structural and personal. And like I said at the beginning, everyone has their own particular stories. I recently wrote about some of mine in an article on care and care washing in university settings. And this was both cathartic and destabilising, quite overexposing in many ways, but useful, hopefully not just for me. So I wrote about being the first person in my family to go to university, about going from a comprehensive, living in a family with parents in what were, working in lower middle class occupations, but also about some of the complicated dynamics around that. So issues of downward mobility, for instance, absent, biologically quite middle class parents. So I discussed the issue as well of what I tend to think now of as being mixed class, and asking why it is that this phrase isn't really in circulation or existence. We have the phrase mixed race, which itself is a kind of product of historical racism, but the language on class sometimes isn't as sophisticated as it should be. I also wrote about growing up in a house where there wasn't a whole lot of cultural capital, about being encouraged to read by my mum, who saw it as a passport to achievement and who also understandably wanted the peace and quiet it brought her, about being supported by a public library system where I just go to bigger and bigger libraries and borrow more and more books, and I worry about the state of that today, how libraries have been cut and stripped back. A lot of the books have been stripped out. A lot of the libraries have been closed down. I wrote about being encouraged to go to university because I was the last generation, in effect, in the UK which got full grants. So this also indicates the intergenerational element of class privilege. I have so much more because I don't have the debt that someone in my position would get 10 years later. So I wrote about my experience of university, the joys, the pleasures, the privileges, the alienation, the strangeness of it all, and how going to a university was a social education, about meeting people from very different backgrounds, losing my accent, becoming different, moving class position, getting posher myself, working in more jobs than most of my peers, going to people's homes that look very, very different, almost like film sets sometimes, kind of learning about social structure, being exposed to more parts of the world. So as well as being therapeutic, I can recommend writing about university experience as a potentially helpful technique for sociology, cultural studies, education and creative writing courses. And I'm very, very much looking forward to hearing Marlena's talk too. But all life stories are very particular and partial. It's interesting to me how recently memoir has surged, and you have some academics complaining about that. So there's a book called Immediacy by Anna Kornbluh, which says this is the product of a narcissistic culture, which is the product of complete individualism. But the ones I have been talking about are ones which also talk about social context. And there's a long history to that. And many of them, really interestingly for me, question the neoliberal meritocratic narrative of social mobility, that we succeed by leaving working class communities and we succeed by leaving other people behind. And there's some really great new work by researchers, emergent researchers on this. So a recent PhD by Miro Born examined the effects of people on the people who left an area in Germany that was deprived and who achieved social mobility, but he also interviewed those people that were left behind. And he came from this place himself. And then he translated the thesis into comic book form so it could be more widely disseminated. And you can find it on the web. It's called Moving On Up. So in conclusion, if we are to reject classism, this can take many different forms. It involves the rejection of stigma, of stereotypes and snobbery. It involves thinking class intersectionally in all its permutations. It involves re-evaluating what we mean by social and cultural capital. Being aware of the power structures that are there and which value certain types of social and cultural capital more, but also asking, what should we value? What do we want to value? It involves putting different stories in social context. It involves questioning social mobility, not popularising a narrative of escape, but thinking what is valuable, kind of questioning the assumptions that we use in our everyday language about what people have been able to do, what kind of holidays they might be able to take or not, what kind of backdrops and support systems they can draw on. Not everyone obviously has a bank of mum and dad. It involves situating our universities within these complex communities. And I think we're all the richer for knowing all the complexity of our communities and for encouraging more cross-pollination between them. And it involves pushing for greater egalitarianism and equality inside and outside the university. And that isn't restricted to the economic, but it does include the economic. So another way of looking at it is that is that we have overwhelmingly been told that what we need to do is to make it up the social pile as individuals in order to succeed, in order to escape our class backgrounds. But this, I think, is a message which has made us go back as societies, because we can only really make it, whether in ethical terms or indeed as a human species, through inclusion. If we make better universities, if we make better societies, if we make better worlds together. Thank you.
God bless your mother. You did a lot of reading. You really did an awful lot of reading. And really thank you so much, Jo, because I think you've taken a really complex set of literature and woven it into a really accessible and provocative piece. I'm still stuck on what it would take to be a trillionaire. I just can't even imagine what a trillion looks like. So I'm sure there's a lot of food for thought here and an awful lot that Jo has shared with us. So can I throw open the floor so for you either to throw your question into the air. Fiona there has one microphone, Deirdre has another.
The first question relates to good practice for language use in the context of access and inclusion.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think that above all, language relates to the context it's used in. So I have problems with some words, it is true, but also that is because they are being used in a particular way or like a fetishized way. So I might have problems with, say, widening participation when it is used at the same time as student fees are being massively hiked in the UK, and there are not very many opportunities for widening participation. So it's when the language doesn't match the social reality, when the language is used to fetishize or disguise some of the social problems that are there, that it becomes a problem. So I recently examined a great PhD at the University of Essex by Chris Cunningham on widening participation. And he's really interesting because he started off as a kind of groundsman caretaker at Essex, and then did a degree and eventually did a PhD on widening participation, as he was a case study. And he talks about how both widening participation is really important, and you can't brush away the fact that the structures need to be there as well. So it's in some ways it's less about the language than the context the language is used in, I think, which is crucial. And at the same time, it's wonderful to see inclusive language when the reality does match the language. So it's been really nice to walk around the campus and see University for All phrases, and just so conspicuously everywhere. And I know there's going to be issues and problems, and that it's a work in progress, but it's just very inspiring to both see that and to know that this is a context where you have such a higher percent of state-educated students that are here, and that it's not as financially difficult for people. I know it is financially challenging, and that's not to minimise it, very much so, but that the extremities haven't been pushed like they have in the UK, and that is something to guard as well as the language. So I think probably what I'm saying is that we have to look beyond the economic, but we also cannot afford to ignore the economic as well.
Question 2. What can educators do to avoid repeating the cycle of exclusion at university because of outmoded assessment practices?
In terms of the bigger picture, I would like less grading and more growth. But I guess in the immediate, pragmatic here and now, one thing that we can do is think about plural modes of assessment. And so, for instance, they all come with their own challenges, don't they? Because presentations have, you learn a lot more about how to do that at public school than you do a state comprehensive school. But I think we need to think about diversity of assessment options and really encourage people to think about university as it's a space for growth and for learning for everyone. So other forms of creative assessment as well. So, for instance, I now work in a cultural studies department, so the assessment options are becoming more porous and opening up. So, we have the possibility of making films or photographs or collages in interesting ways. But, I've done things like that in sociology departments too. So maybe we need to consider expanding the range as well.
It's a good way to end. That's a lovely way to finish this part. Joe is going to stay with us, so many more of you may like to have a conversation. Joe, I think you really have provoked and prompted and given us a huge amount of food for thought. But thank you very much. Well done.